Hello, I'm Co-Sunlight, or in some Discords I go by Rumble Badger, and today I'm going to talk about an intro to MapleStory damage formulas and optimization, mostly focusing on the damage formulas and what I think are good ways to think about them, and sort of giving you the tools to do optimization on your own if you want. Yeah, let's get started. Here's the things that I want to talk about. As an overview, I want to talk about broadly the damage formula for MapleStory, or at least the relevant pieces of it, especially with an eye towards optimization. So as part of that, we're going to look at a bunch of multipliers on your damage, basically. We'll talk about how to think about those multipliers, and we'll talk about each of the relevant multipliers. So there's a damage percent multiplier, which we'll talk about in bossing and mobbing. There's a critical damage percent multiplier. There's an attack multiplier, which sort of breaks down into an attack percent multiplier, which is usually what you actually care about, and we'll talk about that as well. There's a stat multiplier and an IED multiplier. Once we have that, and we have all the tools to kind of understand how to think about our damage and how to increase it, I do want to talk about as well partial uptime buffs. This is, I think, an often overlooked thing that is very relevant for optimization. So I want to talk about that in the once we have the context of all these different damage multipliers. And then there's a few miscellaneous topics that I want to address as well, which are final damage multipliers, ignore elemental resist, and attack percent with final attack. These are all like pretty niche topics, but I didn't feel like this was complete without it, so I included them. Anyway, let's start by talking about the important thing, which is the MapleStory damage formula, at least the parts that we care about. Here's the formula. So I wrote damage here. You should think of this as like your damage output, or like, just your damage output, how much you're doing, how much damage you're doing. And here's basically all of the relevant sources of how you can increase your damage. We're going to ignore this first box for a second. We have a damage multiplier, so this is a source that's coming from damage percent and boss percent. We have critical damage, which is coming from your critical damage percent. We have attack, which is coming from sources of plus attack and also percent attack. We have your stat, which is like your strength, dex, whatever, that type of stuff, and your IED. And these 5 pieces basically make up most of your damage formula, at least that's relevant for optimization purposes. We're going to treat everything else, and by everything else I mean things like the damage percent of your skills that you use, and like every weapon has its own like weapon multiplier, all that junk, all that other stuff. We're just going to put it in this big black box and say we don't really care about it. The nice thing is that all of these multipliers that I talked about, the reason I'm saying multipliers is they literally are like multiplied together. Everything's just multiplied together, and that becomes your damage output in the end. So we can sort of address them each individually and talk about how they each affect your damage, and move on from there. Okay, so the first thing I want to give context for is just what I mean by a multiplier and how to think about multipliers in terms of optimizing your damage. And then we're going to go through each of these colored boxes here and talk about those specific multipliers. So how to think about multipliers. If you want to see how much more or less damage you do if your multiplier changes, if one of these multipliers changes, here's what you do. You compute your damage output multiplier, which is your new multiplier, whatever it is now, divided by the old multiplier. So, brief example, if my damage multiplier goes from 2 times to 3 times, I plug that in here, my new multiplier is 3, my old multiplier was 2, I get 3 divided by 2, which is 1.5. That means my damage output multiplier is 1.5. I'm doing 1.5 times the damage that I used to do, or in other words, 50% more damage than I used to do. But I'm going to be talking mainly, by thinking of things mainly as multipliers, so I'll say like 1.5 times the damage most of the time. If you want an example with maybe slightly more realistic numbers, other than 1.5 times the damage, that's a lot. Let's say your old multiplier for one of these multipliers was 2.1, and then you make some gains. Maybe you get some new damage percent sources from like a new familiar or something, and your new multiplier becomes 2.3. Then you do 2.3 divided by 2.1, and you get this damage output multiplier of 1.095. So that means you do 1.095 times the damage that you used to do, or in other words, your damage increased by 9.5%. Sorry about having all this text on screen as well. I'm going to put a link to these slides in the description to this video, but I want the slides to somewhat stand on their own, so I wrote out a bunch of things that I'm also going to say, and you just got to deal with it. Anyway, hopefully this example gives you some idea of how to think about multipliers. You could also be thinking about how much damage you're losing in certain cases, hopefully not too often. But especially if you're trading one thing for another, like you're trading an IED line for a boss line or something, one of your multipliers is going to go down, one of them is going to go up. Yeah, and we'll talk about how to do that on the next page, but this number might not always be bigger than 1. So, you know, if you get a multiplier of 0.9, it means you're doing 10% less damage than you used to do, or you're doing 0.9 times the damage that you used to do. Another brief aside here, another probably more common phrase for damage output multiplier, as I wrote above, is like a final damage multiplier. I'm using damage output multiplier here to try to differentiate it from sources of final damage percent, but if you see other people do final damage multiplier or whatever, that's totally fine. They mean the same thing. Sources of final damage are direct like multipliers on your damage output, so it's perfectly fine to talk about it as like final damage multipliers, but I'm going to try to use damage output multiplier just to be extra clear what I mean, that I'm literally talking about how much damage that you're doing. Okay, yeah, let's move on. So a few quick notes. Your damage output is affected by each multiplier independently. So if we go back to this formula real quick, if my damage multiplier doubles, that means my damage output here literally doubles regardless of everything else. So everything else is just staying the same. Everything here is just multiplied together, which means each of these affects your damage output directly. If I have two things changing, so let's say my damage output, my damage percent multiplier here doubles, but my IED multiplier triples, those get multiplied together. So this is like 2 times, this is 3 times. I multiply those, I get 6 times. My damage is literally 6 times what it used to be. That's a very contrived extreme example, but yeah, just to give you an idea, if 2 of your multipliers are changing, you can multiply the answers that you get. Why they're called multipliers, why I'm saying this word so many times, is you just multiply them. You multiply them, that's what you do. That's what you do with multipliers, you multiply things. Okay, yeah, and your resulting damage output multiplier is just the product of those things. Okay, we've talked a bit about multipliers. Let's get into the specifics of looking at one of these multipliers and seeing how we compute it. So first I'm going to focus on the damage percent multiplier. Briefly, this is a slightly different when bossing versus mobbing. When you're bossing, your damage percent and your boss percent are added together. Like literally just add them together, and you'll get what I'm going to refer to as effective damage percent. This isn't like a established term or an official term or anything, but it's what I'm going to be using here. When you're attacking a normal mob, your damage percent and your normal damage percent, your normal mob damage percent are added together. I'm going to focus mainly on the bossing case, but if you want to do normal mob stuff, you can. As I say here in the 3rd bullet point, it's much less common to worry about normal mob optimization, but you can do it. Just anytime I say boss percent, replace it in your head with normal mob damage percent, and you're good to go. As another warning before we get to the formula, I'm starting with damage percent because it's one of the most approachable multipliers to talk about at first, and it's a good archetypal example, but there are lots of hidden sources of damage percent and boss percent that are really easy to ignore. And so finding your actual effective damage percent can take some time. It can be difficult. Just here's a list of examples of things that you might be missing if all you're doing is looking at your damage percent and boss percent in your skill window or your stat window. First of all, there's sometimes damage percent or boss percent on certain skills, like maybe you have a hyper passive that gives plus 20% damage to this skill or whatever. There's also links that don't show in the stat window, so links like Cadena Link or Mage Link won't show up in your damage percent in your stat window at all, even if you're attacking something. There's certain links that need to be stacked up, like Arc Link. Yeah, you won't see this unless you're attacking for a while. For many classes of burst buffs that give damage percent, and plus like basically everyone uses AB Link. We'll talk about how to deal with is partial uptime stuff, meaning like, yeah, burst buffs or AB Link, things that aren't 100% uptime. We'll talk about those in a later section, like how to deal with that specifically, but they do affect kind of your effective damage percent in some way. And lastly, Fatal Strike node. Yeah, it's only active 2 seconds plus server lag every 30 seconds, but it can be a pretty significant source of damage percent. So anyway, this is things that you could be missing if all you're doing is looking at the stat window. So just be wary of assuming too much just based off what's in your stat window. But let's get to the exciting thing, which is computing our first multiplier. Your damage multiplier is 1 plus your effective damage percent. So again, that's damage percent plus boss percent divided by 100. Or if you're mobbing, your effective damage percent is damage percent plus normal mob percent. I'm going to take a moment to stop here and just break down what this means real quick, or try to explain where this formula comes from, because if you're not used to these things, it might look very bizarre. So first of all, we have this 1 here. What does this mean? Imagine for the moment that you had 0 effective damage percent, right? You had 0 damage percent, 0 boss percent. You're just on a new character or something. You still do damage, right? Like if my damage multiplier was 0, and we go back to this formula at the beginning, if this damage multiplier was 0, this would be 0 times whatever is just going to be 0. That would mean I'm doing 0 damage. So there definitely needs to be something here. What this 1 is referring to is kind of like a base 1 times damage that you're doing, or a base 100% damage. You might see it referred to that way as well. And that's just like when you go around on a new character and you're hitting mobs, you still do some damage. You're just doing 1 times your damage. So you have no extra damage sources coming from damage percent or boss percent yet. But you still do something. You still do 1 times kind of your base damage. So let's do an example where we do have damage percent and boss percent, and that might help give some more context as well. Let's say my damage percent is 120% and my boss percent is 310%. My effective damage percent, then I add those together, 120 plus 310 is 430%. So computing my damage multiplier here, my damage multiplier is 1 plus 430 divided by 100, so 1 plus 4.3, which is 5.3. And what this means, the interpretation, is this means I'm doing 5.3 times the damage that I would do with 0% damage and 0% boss, right? So if I had no extra damage percent sources, I'm doing 1 times damage, and with this damage multiplier, I'm doing 5.3 times the damage. We're also going to see this divided by 100 a lot, where it's basically just converting a percent to a decimal. So we'll see this a bunch, get used to seeing it a bunch. Anyway, this type of formula is going to show up a lot where we have like a 1 plus some percent divided by 100. We'll see it many, many times. So hopefully it makes sense and you have this ingrained in your brain. This is all I'm going to say about damage percent. Let's move on to the next multiplier, which is the critical damage multiplier. So the critical damage multiplier is very similar to the damage multiplier, both in name and general structure. One thing you do have to watch out for is there is a hidden source of critical damage that is not shown in the stat window or explained like anywhere in game at all. and that's that even if you have 0% crit damage in your stat window, critical attacks still do more damage than non-critical attacks. Specifically, they do between 20 and 50% more damage than non-crit attacks. It's just random between 20 and 50%, completely uniformly random, and it averages to 35% extra critical damage, basically. That's not shown anywhere. Also, quick note for this multiplier, I'm going to assume 100% crit rate. You can do it without 100% crit rate and do extra stuff, but I'm just going to simplify it, say, hey, you should be at 100% crit rate anyway, in almost all cases, and we're just going to go with it from there. Okay, so what is the critical damage multiplier? Here it is. The critical damage multiplier is, I wrote it in two different ways here, 1.35 plus the critical damage percent divided by 100. This should look very similar to the one we had before for damage percent, except instead of 1, I have this 1.35. This 0.35 is coming from that hidden 35% critical damage that I was just talking about. You could rewrite it in this other way that I have here, the second way that I wrote it here, 1 plus, in parentheses, 35%, that hidden 35% plus your critical damage percent, and then you divide that by 100 instead. Whatever floats your boat, you can do it. Yeah, I usually use this first way, but yeah, do whatever you want. So let's do an example of computing this critical damage multiplier. Let's say you have 60% critical damage in your stat window, and then you compute this. The critical damage multiplier is 1.35 plus 60, coming from your 60% critical damage, divided by 100. So you get 1.35 plus 0.6, you get 1.95. So the interpretation of this is you are doing 1.95 times the damage you would do if you weren't doing any criticals at all. Again, this is just looking at the multiplier itself. If you want to compute like damage gain, like your final damage gains or damage output gains from getting new sources of critical damage percent, you'll want to go back to this here where we talked about how to compute like your damage output changing. So if you got a new, let's say you rolled 2-line crit on your gloves and you have a new source of 8% critical damage, then you went from 60 to 68% critical damage, and you would get a 0.68 here instead of a 0.6, and you would have like 2.03 or something here. You take 2.03 divided by 1.95, blah, blah, blah. I'm saying a bunch of numbers. You get some new damage output. You do more damage. Yay. That's the idea. Okay. Yeah, that's all I want to say about the critical damage multiplier. So let's move on to the attack multiplier. I'm going to split this kind of into two sections. There's like a raw just plus attack. I'm using plus here just to differentiate from percent attack, but it's literally the attack stat. So you get attack from gear, from Star Force, all this kind of stuff from set effects. There are many sources, and that multiplier itself, just looking at the plus attack that you have, is rarely useful for optimization purposes. So really what we're going to do eventually is split out the attack percent multiplier from that and just to deal directly with that, and that's usually far more useful. So here's some information about the plus attack multiplier and why you really shouldn't care about it that much. First of all, there's very few cases where you are going to trade plus attack for something else. Like percent attack, you might be trading for boss damage or IED or something on your WSE, so it's useful to know like how these multipliers are changing. For plus attack, it's like you get as much as you can from like Star Force or whatever. You're rarely trading that for something else. The closest would be like flames or something, or if you play reg server, I guess like scrolling or something. But usually in those cases, it's like more clear what's better. So you don't need to debate about this that much. Yeah. So if you do want to deal with the plus attack multiplier, the value is simply the total amount of attack that you have. And I'm bringing this up here because it's incredibly annoying to find that value. Your total attack is not shown to you anywhere in game, and so you'd have to calculate it yourself, like trying to find every source of plus attack, every piece of gear, every set effect, any skills that you have that give plus attack, all this crazy stuff. There's some ways of back calculating it that you could do, but it's just a pain no matter what. Percent attack directly affects your total attack. I'm moving to this third bullet point here. Percent attack directly affects your total attack, and since your attack is proportional to your damage, right? Then I'll show this more in the next slide with some pictures. But this means effectively that we can pull this attack percent multiplier out, and we can view it as its own multiplier directly affecting your damage. So here's the promised picture, which is really just boxes. Sorry if that's disappointing, but I call it here discovering the attack percent multiplier. Your attack multiplier is just your total attack. We can break it down into a few sources. You have base attack, which is coming from your gear, and set effects, etc. And then this is multiplied against the attack percent multiplier, which I haven't defined quite yet, and that is going to give you your total attack. I put this note here, I'm lying very slightly. I'll talk about this at the very, very end, but technically there could be sources of final attack, which makes this whole thing break down in some way, and you can't really talk about attack percent directly affecting your output damage. But unless you play Kana, that's completely irrelevant. You can just go with this. This is totally fine. And if you do play Kana, you can see that at the end, and I'll basically tell you this is a massive pain and you shouldn't worry about it. Anyway, okay. So briefly, let's take this picture, keep this in our heads. The attack multiplier is your base attack times attack percent. If we go back to the very beginning where we had this big damage formula and we had this attack multiplier, we can basically break this into two boxes of your base attack times your attack percent. And we can just say, hey, your base attack doesn't matter that much. Let's just stick it in this big box of things that we don't care about and leave an attack percent multiplier here instead. And that's how we can get to where your attack percent is directly affecting your damage output, along with all these other multipliers. So really, most of the time, we are just thinking about attack percent directly affecting your damage output. And I mentioned this already, but because it's more common to do these calculations comparing attack percent to boss percent or IED or whatever, it tends to be far more useful. So let's look at this attack percent multiplier more in depth. It looks very similar to the multipliers we've seen so far. It follows the same structure. We have 1 plus your attack percent divided by 100. And that's your attack percent. Note, just like plus attack, your attack percent is not recorded in game anywhere, and you have to calculate it by hand. Here's basically all the sources that I could think of where your attack percent is going to come from. It's going to come from mainly your weapon secondary and emblem potentials. You hopefully get lots of attack percent on those if you're lucky. And then also you can get it on familiar lines and badges. Usually it's not optimal on familiar lines. You go after like boss and IED and whatever, but you can get it on familiar lines. But familiar badges, yeah, everyone should have like 3% attack, up to a maximum of 3% attack from your badges. There are certain class skills that give attack percent. For example, Wild Hunter buff is a party buff even that gives 10% attack. Kaiser has a like 30% attack skill. It's not a party buff, but it's just their own skill that gives them 30% attack. Mihail has 30% attack during their main burst skill. Anyway, I'm sure there are other percent attack sources out there. But anyway, certain class skills have percent attack. Also, certain Oz rings. Ring of Restraint is the most common one, but also Risk Taker and Crisis HM, which is basically just a dojo ring. Those all give attack percent as well. If you want to deal with these partial uptime stuff, so like the Mihail skill or Oz rings, and you want to deal with the like kind of effective attack percent from those, we'll cover that later in the partial uptime buff section. But let's just do a quick example to make sure we can compute this attack percent multiplier. Let's say you have 90% attack total. Your attack percent multiplier is just going to be 1 plus 90 divided by 100, so 1.9. And what this means is you're doing 1.9 times the damage you would do with 0% attack. All right, that's all about the attack multiplier. Let's move on to the stat multiplier. The stat multiplier is a bit more complicated than what we've been dealing with in the past. And it's also generally less useful, so if you want to skip it, you totally can. But I've included it because I didn't think this would be complete without it. And maybe you're just curious. The thing that you need to know for the stat multiplier is you need to know your class's primary stat and secondary stat. For most classes, this is like pretty obvious. So like for warriors, it's usually strength is your primary stat, and then dex is your secondary stat. For bowmen, it's like dex is your primary stat and strength is your secondary stat, blah, 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 this type of thing. There are a few exceptions to this rule. First of all, if you are a Shadower, Cadena, or Dual Blade, both strength and dex are secondary stats for you. So on the next slide, when I talk about your secondary stat value, just take your strength and dex and add them together. Like just add them together. Xenon, if you're a Xenon, strength, dex, and luck are all primary stats. So when I ask you about your primary stat value on the next slide, just add up your strength, dex, and luck. And Xenon has no secondary stats, so just put 0 for that. If you're a Demon Avenger, it's a bit messier, and it's messy enough I didn't want to put it in the slides. So I put a link in here to the wiki, to this formulas page, and if you just Control F for the pure stats and stat value section, that'll give you what you need. Look for the stuff about DA there. The stat value on this page, they call it stat value, but I'm going to call your stat multiplier on the next slide. So just know that going forward, just look for stat value stuff. So for every class except Demon Avenger, your stat multiplier is your primary stat plus your secondary stat divided by 4. In some ways, you can kind of think of this as secondary stat is like 1/4 as important as primary stat. Note of caution there. I'm not saying like, maybe I shouldn't have said that. Like usually, in terms of damage output, because there's other stuff going on with like you have a lot of primary stat percent and usually not as much secondary stat percent. Usually like on a flame or something plus, you need more like +10 or +12 secondary stat to be worth even just +1 primary stat. So yeah, don't take too much by this 4 number. But in terms of your stat multiplier, this is how the formula goes. It's your primary stat plus secondary stat divided by 4. So here we're going to do sort of a full example of, let's look at our stat multiplier and like see what happens if we make some gains and get a new multiplier and see how much damage we gained. So let's say you have 40k primary stat and 8k secondary stat. That would make your stat multiplier. Do this thing, plug it into the formula above, 40k plus 8k divided by 4, you get a stat multiplier of 42,000. Let's say you cube some stuff, you keep some gear, you get some extra primary stat percent, you gain 5k primary stat, and your secondary stat is completely unchanged. So now you have 45k primary stat and you have 8k secondary stat still. If you do the same computation, you're going to get that your stat multiplier is 47k. So now we want to go find how much has our damage output increased, or how much final damage did we gain. We go back to this formula from the very beginning where we were talking about multipliers. Our damage output multiplier is going to be my new multiplier, 47k, divided by my old multiplier, 42k. And that gets us about 1.12. So in other words, you got 1.12 times as strong, or your damage output increased by 12% doing this. I'm just going to say this next part verbally, but if you notice, this secondary stat is usually not that relevant. These are like approximately normal values, 40k main stat, 8k secondary stat, and even if you get up to like 60k main stat, you usually don't have that much more secondary stat. If you just want a rough approximation of like how much damage you're getting from increasing your stat by some amount, you can just kind of ignore this term. If I did it in this case, it would have been like 45k divided by 40k instead of 47 divided by 42, and in that case it would say that your damage is increasing by 12.5% instead of 12%. It's at least good enough for a rough approximation. If you do want to be careful and you do want to be exact, you should use this full formula, but just for anyone curious, you can just kind of look at the primary stat as at least a decent approximation of how much damage you're getting. Okay, that's all for stat. Let's move on to the IED multiplier. This is going to be one of the more complicated ones formulaically, both in terms of finding your IED and also the actual multiplier, but it is very relevant for optimization, so I do think it's worth at least seeing. A few quick notes. Your IED multiplier is going to depend on the PDR of the boss. I'll define what PDR and IED means if this looks like a word salad so far. But most relevant bosses are 300 PDR. So everything from Lotus and Damien up through Black Mage is 300 PDR. There's some 380 PDR bosses past that and some lower PDR bosses before. But most cases here, I'm just going to talk about 300 PDR bosses. So what does PDR mean? PDR means percent damage reduction. It's a little weird to say 300% damage reduction, but let's imagine for a moment in our heads that we're talking about 50% damage reduction. So 50 PDR, that would literally be cutting your damage in half, right? It's a 50% reduction in the damage that you're doing, is what it means by 50 PDR. So 300 PDR sort of sounds like you'd be doing like negative damage or something. The game handles that by just making you hit ones if there's enough PDR. But how do we counteract this? How do we actually do damage against 300 PDR bosses? Well, we use IED. So IED stands for Ignore Enemy Defense, and it lets us basically cut down on the PDR of the boss. So let's say you're attacking a 300 PDR boss and you had a 50% source of IED. That's going to cut it in half, literally cut the PDR in half from 300 down to 150. If you got another source of 50% IED, it would cut it in half again from 150 down to 75. And suddenly we're doing at least 25% of our maximum damage basically, and hitting more than ones, which is great. Again, just like some of the previous multipliers, there are some hidden sources of IED that you do want to be careful of. And make sure you're including for optimization purposes. Some common ones that you might be missing are Mageling. Mageling, you have to stack up, adds it up to a total of 9% IED at max stacks and at max level. There's Node IED. It's very common to have all of your skills have an extra 20% IED from nodes getting to level 40 or above level 40. There's certain class skills that give IED. So make sure you're including those, and also IED debuffs on the boss. This can be in a party setting or solo. There are some IED debuffs that don't show up in your stat window. Okay. So here's the IED multiplier formula. Sorry, it's a bit messier than the previous ones we've looked at, but I'll try to break it down into kind of what each of these terms mean, and hopefully it makes more sense from there. And if you just need to plug and chug the numbers, you can just plug and chug the numbers. So what does this IED multiplier look for? It starts in the same way as we had before. We have this 1 at the beginning. All of our previous multipliers have been like 1 plus something. And that's sort of to indicate that they're like increasing your damage a lot off of like your base. Like if you had no damage percent and you gain damage percent, you're going let me rephrase. If you had no damage percent, you're still doing like 1 times your damage. Well, that's not always the case with IED because of this PDR thing. So in some sense with IED, the maximum possible damage you could be doing is 1 times your damage. And usually you're doing less than that because of PDR. So that's why instead of followed by a plus sign, we kind of have this minus sign here. This next term, just like before, we have this divided by 100 because this PDR is really a percent, right? That's what the P stands for. This is some percent damage reduction. We divide by 100 to convert it to a decimal. And we multiply by this last term here in parentheses, which is this 1 minus IED over 100. And this we should think of as like a scaling term that's scaling down the PDR of the boss. And I'll re-say this again when we do an example, but it's hopefully making this PDR thing very small, so that way we're doing as close to 100% or 1 times our full damage as we can. I rewrote this formula smaller down below just for 300 PDR bosses. This PDR over 100 term just becomes a 3. It looks a little more simple. So in that case, the IED multiplier becomes 1 minus 3 times the scaling term that's based off your IED, which is 1 minus your IED over 100. And note, I said this earlier, but a negative IED value, or if your IED multiplier comes out to 0, this will result in you just hitting 1s on the boss. That's how the game handles that. You're not actually doing negative damage or anything. So let's do an example of computing your IED multiplier real quick. Let's say you're attacking a 300 PDR boss. We can use this slightly simpler formula, and you have an IED of 95%. What is your IED multiplier? It's going to be 1 minus 3 times the scaling term, so 1 minus 95 from our 95 IED divided by 100. So we get 1 minus 3 times 0.05. In the end, it works out to 0.85. So the interpretation here is you're doing 0.85 times, or 85% of sort of your full damage, what you could be doing if there was no PDR on the boss, or if you somehow had 100 IED. Okay, a quick note about the IED formula. Notice it's not as clear what to do when you get new sources of IED. So for all of our previous multipliers, it was very easy to say like, oh, you have some critical damage percent, you get a new source of critical damage percent, you just add it on. You get, right, you add on 8 critical damage percent from your new glove line, or you add on 30 boss from your new familiar, or whatever. And in this case, for IED, it's not as clear. How do you find your new IED value if you get a new source of IED? So the next slide is going to cover that, and it's, again, gross. I apologize. It's formulaically looks very gross. I have this in-word section that's going to explain it. In the idea behind IED is fairly simple, I promise, but formulaically it just works out really gross. So this is the whole formula for if you're at some IED percent and you get a new source of IED. So we have some old IED percent, we get a new IED source, we're finally going to get to a new IED percent on the left here. This is what the formula looks like. It's a bit gross. I'm sorry. So you have 100% minus 100% minus your old IED percent times 100% minus your new IED source percent. So if you're getting a new 30% source, you would put in 30 here, and then you divide this by 100, and that is going to become your new IED percent. If you factor out some 100s, you can rewrite it in a different way. To me, this is simpler, but I don't know if it is to everyone else. You have this 100% that we pulled out, we factored out from everything, and then you have this 1 minus old IED percent divided by 100. This is showing up again, this divided by 100 of converting a percent to decimal basically, and times 1 minus your new IED source divided by 100 again to convert it to a decimal. And yeah, these end up being identical, but they just look a little bit different. Pick whatever floats your boat. Okay, as promised, in words, the idea behind IED is fairly simple. A new source of X% IED gets you X% of the way closer to 100, basically, to the max 100 IED possible. So, for example, if you're at 80 IED and you get a new source of 50% IED, that's going to give you 50% of the way from 80 to 100. So half the way from 80 to 100 would be 90, right? So that 50% IED is going to take you from 80% to 90%. If you're at 90% IED and you get a new source of 30% IED, that's going to take you 30% of the way from 90 to 100, which in that case would be 3, like plus 3 up to 93. So that idea of like it's getting you some percent of the way closer to the maximum possible value of 100 is how it works. Formulaically, it looks like this. It's just gross, but there's not really a simpler way to write it. So let's do a less contrived example of the cherry pick numbers that I just picked. Let's say you're currently at 91.52% IED and you get a new source of 30% IED. let's calculate what our new IED would be after we put on the new 30% IED source. Our new IED percent is going to be 100% minus 100 minus 91.52. That's 91.52 coming from our current IED percent, times 100 minus 30. So this 30 is coming from our new source of 30 IED. We divide by 100 there. If you plug this into a calculator or do some crazy mental math, you get it to 94.064% IED. I also below just plugged it into the other formula in case you want it as reference, but of course you get the same value in the end. As a quick note, you can kind of estimate this using my in words description, right? 91.52 is a bit above 90%. So in the example I did earlier, when we were at 90% and we got a 30% source of IED, that gets us 30% of the way closer to 100. So that would bring us to 93. It's like a +3 on our IED value. In this case, since we're already a little bit closer to 100, we won't get quite a +3, but we'll get a little bit less. You might guesstimate around 2.5% or something more. And in this case, that ends up being pretty accurate. 91.52, if you just added 2.5%, would get you to like 94.02 or something. Pretty close. But if you do want to get the exact value, you do have to go through this whole formula, and it's a bit of a pain. There's no way around it. It's just painful. Okay, that's everything on the multipliers. So we've covered, going back to the beginning, the damage multiplier, the critical damage multiplier, the attack multiplier, which we basically turned into an attack percent multiplier, a stat multiplier, and an IED multiplier. And you should now have the knowledge of how to compute these multipliers, how to figure out how that's going to affect your damage output, all that stuff. So now I'm going to go on to a few different topics. The first and main thing that I want to talk about is partial uptime buffs. As I mentioned earlier, these are often overlooked, but they can significantly affect your multipliers. So I do want to discuss them and talk about how to deal with them. So here's some examples of partial uptime buffs. By partial uptime, I just mean not 100% uptime. So anything that has like a duration shorter than its cooldown. It's up for 30 seconds, so there's a cooldown of 2 minutes or whatever. Those buffs are partial uptime buffs. So often like class burst buffs might be a source of like plus damage percent or whatever during burst. Oz rings can be a significant source of either stat or attack percent or whatever during burst. And AB link is something that almost everyone uses that gives damage percent during burst. So even if your class doesn't have stuff, you got Oz rings, you got AB link, you still kind of got to deal with this in some way. So why do we need to deal with these partial uptime buffs? During the duration of the buffs, your multipliers can be very heavily skewed. Probably the most extreme example is if you have a Ring of Restraint 4 that gives plus 100% attack during its duration. It only lasts 15 seconds, but 100% attack is a ton. Like if you're in Reboot and you have like basically every source of attack percent that you can have outside of class-specific skills, you usually have less than 100% attack total. So your attack percent multiplier is like 2 or a bit below usually. And then you stick on a Roar 4, and for 15 seconds you have another plus 100 attack. That's going to bring your multiplier up to 3. So you're doing literally 1.5 times the damage you're doing when Roar is not active, which is just a crazy amount of skew on your damage. And you'll see usually not as extreme of values, but similar things with damage percent from class buffs or AB link or whatever. And so this third bullet point, depending how much damage you're doing during those buffs, it can greatly influence optimization. So it might be easy to say in your head like, oh, Ring of Restraint only lasts 15 seconds. I can kind of ignore it, but really you can't. Like it might only last 15 seconds, but you might be doing 30, 40 in some scenarios, especially like for certain classes, or if you have significant party buffs or something, you might be doing 50% or sometimes even way more. That much of your damage is happening while Ring of Restraint is active, and this can greatly affect your optimization. So this last bullet point is kind of the information that you're going to need to know in order to properly do this, and it is some work. So I'm just warning you ahead of time. But if you want to appropriately count for like burst buffs like this, like AB link or any class buffs or Oz rings or whatever, you need to know the percent of your damage output that is done while that buff is active. So an easy way to at least guesstimate test this is like you go into the dojo room where you can attack a dummy and you do a full rotation BA and you record it, and you can look at the video and see like, okay, how much damage was done while Ring of Restraint was active versus like your total damage, right? Like what percent of your damage was done while Ring of Restraint was active. It's pretty common for that number to be like 25-30%, even for not particularly bursty classes. For very bursty classes, it can be as high as like 50. It can also be, lower than what I said, like 25-30. It could be, 20 or whatever, but usually not much below that. And a quick note here, I'm mainly going to talk about like durational buffs, but if you do want to account for like certain buffs that apply only to certain attacks, like for example, hyper passives that give plus 20% damage to one of your skills, it's a very similar computation, and I'll try to clarify in the next slide how you would do that. But before I go, I just said, oh yeah, you can do a full rotation BA and kind of estimate some things. Note this all gets skewed when you go into an actual boss as well. Like in an actual boss, you aren't just sitting there attacking it like it's a dummy. So your damage gets skewed by, usually like burst is weighted more heavily because you're careful to set that up where you're going to get your burst off, and your off burst is like, maybe there's things that stop you from attacking the boss more during there, whatever. The point is, there is a bit of guesstimation here that has to happen, but I do think it's worth at least loosely accounting for these partial uptime buffs, and trying to get a good estimate for how they're affecting your ratios, because otherwise you could just be way out of whack. So here's what you need to do once you actually have, once you actually know how much of your damage is done during certain buffs. The effective percent value of the buff is equal to the actual percent value of the buff. So for example, AB Link, this would be like 60% damage if you have level 3 AB Link. And you multiply that by the fraction of damage that's done while that buff is active. Or I rewrote it in a slightly different way in the second line. You take the percent value of the buff and you multiply by the percent of damage done while that buff is active divided by 100. Again, the divided by 100 is just converting from a percent to a decimal, or basically to a fraction. So let's do some examples to kind of get our head wrapped around this. For example 1, let's say you do a full rotation BA and you do about 25% or around 1/4 of your damage while AB Link is active. This might sound very high, but especially if you have some buff duration, it's probably a decent guess. Might be a bit lower, but it's a decent guess. Again, very class dependent. But we do the following calculation. The effective damage percent of AB Link then is going to be 60% damage, right? That's how much damage level 3 AB Link gives you while it's active, times 1/4, coming from our 1/4 of our damage is being done while that buff is active, and we get 15% damage. So when we're computing our effective damage percent to look at our damage multiplier, we would include an extra 15% damage from AB Link if these numbers match reality for you. For a more extreme example, say you're a Night Lord and you do about 50% of your full rotation while Roar 4 is active. Like in those 15 seconds, Night Lord just absolutely poops out damage. And yeah, so then the effective damage percent, the effective attack percent of Roar 4 would be 100% attack. It gives you 100% attack for 15 seconds times 1/2. And so that means the effective attack percent is 50%. This is probably a slight exaggeration for like a solo Night Lord against a dummy, but in practical bosses, might even be an under exaggeration, and especially with party buffs, this Night Lords can do like 80+% of their damage during World War, depending on the situation. Anyway, this is like a very extreme example. This last example I've included just because I want to mention specifically IED works the same way. IED might seem like it's going to be weirder because it has a more complicated formula or whatever. But once we've reduced everything to multipliers, this all works the same. Or not even in this case, we haven't reduced the multipliers yet, but it does work out the same. You can do the same math. So for example, Mihail has true 100% IED during Radiant Soul, and usually they do about 50% of their full rotation while Radiant Soul is active. So in that case, you have an effective IED of 50% coming from that skill. And the math does work out. I'm not going to do it here, but it does work out that it is an accurate thing. Okay. I want to talk briefly about party buffs, kind of in a related topic here. There are many party buffs that give various stats during, usually during burst. So for example, like Arc buff gives some damage percent during burst. Shadower's Smoke gives critical damage during burst, or like Pathfinder's Bubble thing gives critical damage. I don't know, these other ones might be harder to come up with examples for. Anyway, I won't give examples for everything, but for most things you can just handle them just like we did here. Like if you want to optimize for a party buff, you know it gives you some damage percent during some portion of your damage. You can guesstimate, hey, that's probably going to be, I'll have arc buff up for, I don't know, 30% of my BA or whatever. You can plug that in, do the same calculation. One thing I do want to highlight that is, it's not really a direct effect on your damage multipliers, like damage percent or boss percent or IED or whatever, but there is an indirect effect from our final damage buffs. So final damage buffs are completely separate. They're just direct multipliers on your damage output. But if you have significant burst final damage buffs, namely Domain from Kana, Benediction from Bishop, or Split from Shade, these can heavily skew your damage profile. So maybe normally you only do 30% of your damage during Roar 4, but you have a Kana with you now, Domain is juicing your damage during burst, maybe it's more like 40% now. I'm just giving you random numbers basically, but just to give an example of how these final damage buffs can skew your damage towards these burst buffs like AV Link or Roar or whatever. So yeah, I kind of say this here. It's not uncommon for a solo player to do about 30% of the damage during Roar if you have a Roar 4, but in a party with a Kana and Bishop, this can get skewed greatly. So I was talking about Kana, it might go up to 40, but if you have Kana and Bishop, those are just massive, massive final damage percent on burst. It could get crazy high depending on the situation. Maybe you're in a boss that's hard to hit outside of bind, whatever. This type of stuff you might want to loosely account for. And anyway, again, like I said before, there is a large amount of guesstimation that goes on here if you want to get into like really specific scenarios. But my main point is these really can skew your ratios, so you should try to account for them in some way, I think at least. Okay, I'm going to move on to various miscellaneous topics. Most of these are pretty niche, so feel free to just stop watching. I'm surprised if you are still watching already. Okay, let's talk about final damage multipliers real quick. So every source of final damage is basically its own multiplier directly on your damage output. So for example, if you have a 15% source of final damage, that's a 1.15 times multiplier on your damage. Or like Kana's Domain is at 33% final damage at max charge, so that's 1.33 times multiplier on your damage while you're in Domain. It's fairly straightforward, but yeah, these are kind of separate from everything else. They just get multiplied directly on your damage output. This is basically reiterating what I said before. Partial uptime final damage multipliers, while they don't directly affect your optimization, they do indirectly do it by skewing the effectiveness of other things like AV Link, Roar, any burst buffs that you have, whatever. So just be careful with those. Another miscellaneous topic, ignore elemental resist. This is a niche thing, but I do want to talk about it. Basically every relevant boss, so definitely everything like CRA plus, but I think even some below that as well, has 50% elemental resist. All these bosses resist all elements, including physical attacks. So for everyone, literally what this means is it resists 50% of your damage. So it literally cuts your damage in half. This is very similar to PDR, as we talked about it before in the IED section. It's basically another PDR-like thing, and it just basically every boss is 50% elemental resist, which is reducing your damage by 50%. Just like with PDR, where we had IED to help ignore it, there is ignore elemental resist, which lets us ignore part of this damage reduction. And it works just like IED. It's the same formula. But in some senses, it's similar because there are only 2 sources of ignore elemental resist in the game. So I'm just going to give you all the relevant numbers that you might need here. So first of all, the one everyone has access to is the insight trait. So if you click on your character and open up your traits, you have insight, and at max at level 100, it gives you 5% ignore elemental status. Ignore elemental resist, which amounts to a 5% final damage multiplier. It's 5% ignore elemental status. Oh my gosh, I said it again. It's 5% ignore elemental resist, and it just, yeah, it's a 5% final damage multiplier, basically, or damage output multiplier. The only other source of ignore elemental resist comes from debuffs from the following classes: Dawn Warrior, Blaze Wizard, and Battle Mage. And they do not stack with each other at all. So they each can give 10% ignore elemental resist, but they don't stack if you have multiple of those classes in your party. Anyway, assuming you have maxed insight, this debuff is effectively a 9.05% final damage debuff on the boss. Yeah, so if you're in a party with any of these classes, you basically have a hidden source of 9.05 final damage coming from these ignore elemental resist debuffs. Yeah, which is pretty absurd. All these classes are like also have other sources of party support, like they're all broken. But anyway, that's a topic for another day, is why support classes are broken. Okay, moving on from that, the last thing I want to talk about is talking about attack percent when you do have final attack. Again, this is only relevant for kanas basically, and I'll talk a bit about why here. So final attack is sources of attack which are not affected by attack percent. That's what I mean by final. It's like added on at the end or something. So you can think about it. So if there were a lot of sources of final attack, we couldn't split out attack percent like we did before. I'm going to briefly scroll back to that slide. If we had instead a base attack times attack percent, if there was this plus final attack at the end here, then attack percent would not be directly affecting our damage. But the good thing is there are basically no sources of final attack in the game. There's a lot of like things that people think might be sources of final attack, but they're not. So just a quick list of things that are not final attack, things that are affected by attack percent. Hyperstat, if you go in your hyperstat, there's this plus attack or plus magic attack, and those are affected by percent. I think people get confused because like the strength, dex, int, luck stuff, those explicitly say not affected by percent or whatever, but the attack and magic attack are affected by percent. They're not final attack sources. Lab server is another one that I think people debate about, because most character cards or all other character cards are like final sources. Like if you have a plus strength character card in your legion, that gives its final stat, and not affected by percent. But the lab server blocks are affected by percent attack, thanks to some guildies who helped me test this. But yeah, they are affected by attack percent. And lastly, inner ability line, with an asterisk here, at least not the line that anyone uses. So a very few classes use this plus 21 attack line, or it's a max of plus 21 attack at unique, and that is affected by percent. So it is not final attack. There is another familiar line that's like plus one attack per 20 levels or something like that. It's trash, and it is final attack, and it's just completely useless, and nobody uses it. So, while technically it exists, you can basically completely ignore it. The one exception to all of this is Kana, and there is another asterisk here that I'll talk about in just a moment. But Kana has a skill called Blessing of the Five Elements, which converts HP to attack. And if you go by range that you get from this, it seems like it's final attack. The asterisk here is there are known bugs with this skill and how it affects your range. Like it seems to affect your range by twice as much as it actually does. Your actual damage on the server side is lower than it looks to you because you have fake inflated range from this skill somehow like counting twice or something. It's very stupid. So anyway, there is kind of this asterisk here of like, if there's those glitches with the range already, it's, I don't know, maybe this actually isn't final attack and it's all fine, and server side it's all good, but if you go by your range increase and try to look at how attack percent affects that, it does seem like the skill is final attack. And it's just, yeah, it's just stupidly hard to test if it's actually final attack or not, without just going by range. So anyway, for now we'll assume, let's say it is final attack. Here's how you can break down the total attack formula. Which again, this total attack is like your plus attack multiplier. And you can break it down into your base attack, where your base attack, I noted down here, but your base attack is any source of attack that is affected by attack percent. So you can take your base attack, multiply by the attack percent formula, and then by the attack percent multiplier, and at the end tack on this final attack, where the attack percent multiplier is, just as we discussed before, 1 plus your total attack percent divided by 100. So again, I mentioned this earlier, but the result of this is your attack percent is not directly affecting your damage output. So this adding the source of plus final attack at the end basically slightly dampens the effect of attack percent. But it's kind of whatever. I don't know. There's a big paragraph at the bottom where I just kind of say like, if you want to really dig into the details of this, if you're a Kana, it's just a massive pain. So Godspeed to you, but it's really hard to find your base attack and your final attack and figure all this out, and it just sucks. And so anyway, I just ranted here at the end about whatever. Kana is in a bad spot anyway right now, so it's like, it's a bad joke. Anyway, that's all the topics that I wanted to cover to the very end. If you are still here, thanks for watching. I do want to shout out a few additional resources in case you are interested. First of all, I linked this earlier when talking about Demon Avenger and stat value there, but the wiki is an absolutely incredible resource. I think someone who plays Maple C maintains it, and anyway, this is an absolutely insane, incredible resource. So I encourage you to check it out if you are curious about some of the details of how this all works, and formulas and whatever in this game. And then as another resource, here's a YouTube channel, Mastering Gaming. This is this guy, Master Robert, or Delusion Dash. This is IGN. He's done a bunch of work for the community on a variety of things, and he heads up the meta community, which has its own Discord. Anyway, if you go to his YouTube, there's like links to other things, but this is another great resource if you want to learn more about the game. And that's it. So if you are still watching, thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful, and I will probably never make one of these again. Anyway, bye.